Thank you, Hans, Jeremy, both very much indeed for joining us in what is a sort of strange lull in the Brexit process. So a moment when perhaps we can try and stand back and look at how Britain looks to the rest of the world right now and how it fits into the global story, if that doesn't sound too grand. Jeremy, can I start with you? How does Britain look to America right now?
Yeah, I think that the Brexit episode has sort of spread, not only has created in American English not only the word Brexit, but also introduced the word Schadenfreude. They've really become quite bemused by it. It's not a very important story in the U.S. and people are very perplexed by it. There's obviously a lot of sort of sympathy and good feeling toward Britain in the United States, but there's also this sense that they've always been making fun of the U.S. for its sort of politics, for its lack of sophistication. That whole idea that Macmillan propounded in the 1960s, that Britain could be Greece to America's Rome. It now seems as if Britain has become Laurel to America's Hardy, and I think that there is a certain amount of sort of satisfaction in that. But honestly, it's not. I think the most important thing is that it's not a very big issue in the United States. It doesn't really engage the public beyond the superficial, and even the elites who do have to deal with it on a daily basis aren't terribly concerned with it.
Let's jump to Europe then. Europe.
I think it's a similar story. There's clearly a lot of Schadenfreude in continental Europe as well. It seems to me that whether we're talking about America or continental Europe, there's this tendency, I think, to see Brexit through the prism of their own domestic political issues. So obviously in America, my impression is that Brexit is seen very much through the prism of Trump, and it's seen to a large extent as being Britain's Trump. I don't think that's quite right, but I think that's the way it's seen. Similarly in Europe, because of this kind of idea of a populist wave, which, as I say, I think is misleading, I think there's a tendency to see Brexit as this kind of equivalent of the Front National in France. Certainly this is the way that Macron sees it, or as the equivalent of the AfD in Germany. And so it's seen, I think, it's clearly in continental Europe a much bigger issue than in America, although there is at the same time in Europe as well, I think this tendency to say, well, it's not that big of an issue for us, partly because there are so many other existential crises that the EU faces. But I think there is this tendency to see it as a threat precisely because it's seen as being analogous to things that are happening elsewhere in Europe, which I think is partly true, but not quite 100% true.
I think it is really quite striking in going through continental Europe at just sort of how advanced they are in their stages of grief over Brexit. They have so internalized, I don't know if they did this on June 24th or maybe by June 30th of 2016, but really they've just they regret that Brexit happened. But they've accepted it. And they accepted it a long time ago. And they've kind of moved on. And they're trying to make the best of it. They're trying not to let it infect their own politics. And that's one of the issues behind the European stance on the negotiation. But there's really not a lot of sort of soul searching or regret, right, or really, or even really a lot of talk about it.
Self-criticism.
Or self-criticism. In Berlin, where ECFR has an office, we struggle to maintain even a conversation on Brexit. People are not interested in talking about it. They don't think that it's an important issue, or rather, to the extent that they think it's an important issue, they think it's already been taken care of to the extent that it can be, and so it's not really all that important.
Michel Barnier always uses this phrase, it's a process to be managed.
Yes.
It really is that.
The decisions for them were taken in the very few months after the referendum. They're comfortable with those decisions. They certainly regret what has happened, and they're not happy about it, but they have sort of moved on.
But I think there are some other things happening, though, slightly beneath the surface. There's this, I think, interesting contradiction in the way that continental Europeans look at Brexit, which is on the one hand to say, the Brits were always a special case. This has nothing to do with the rest of continental Europe. They had their own particular problems with membership of the EU. They're not shared elsewhere in the EU. At the same time, to say part of the reason we can't make any concessions is precisely because of the danger that if we do, other EU member states start to demand the same things.
Contagion was always the word used, wasn't it?
And these two things don't quite add up. So, and the other thing that seems to me to be happening in continental Europe is there's this, there's been somewhat, it's been a bit of triumphalism, I think, about particularly the polling that shows that support for the European Union has gone up, since the Brexit vote.
What's that about?
Well, I think it's mainly about fear, personally. I think, it's not that, the Europeans, for example, in the south of Europe or in the east of Europe, for that matter, who had really big issues with the way that the EU is being run, suddenly have come to love it. I think they can see the chaos that Brexit has caused in Britain, and so it's really fear that's holding the European Union together, which I think is really problematic.
I mean, that's fine. I just think that there's maybe a slightly different way of looking at it, which is that contagion was a massive fear right after the referendum. And the process that the Europeans have managed has contained that contagion quite effectively. One of our research shortly after the election showed that they were considering these types of referendums in like 18 different countries in the EU right after the British referendum. None of them have happened. None of them are even in prospect right now.
And now we hear that the populist movements that are obviously trying to make headway in the European Parliament elections this spring aren't deploying Brexit as part of their argument. Is that because
it's something in a way that's even more dangerous from the EU perspective, it seems to me, which is to try to destroy the EU from within? I mean, the United Kingdom always basically stuck to the rules. It sometimes, negotiated opt-outs and so on. But what I think you have with, the Hungarian government, the Polish government, the Italian government to some extent, is an attempt to, as I say, disrupt the EU from within, which I think is much more dangerous actually than simply choosing to leave.
Yeah, that's, I think, where I was going. The idea, I think, that the new strategy for people who are dissatisfied with the EU, and Viktor Orban says this quite directly, is not to leave the EU, but to reform it. And that is, coming from Viktor Orban, that's quite a chilling word.
Yeah, but he means what by the word reform? It sounds rather gentle.
He means essentially neutering it as a supranational organization, making it a council where they can come together, to cooperate, and they can make some, and they can have some sort of single market and economic cooperation, but not an organization which impinges on sovereignty. Ironically, the type of organization that Britain would have loved to have been a member of.
Right, although in some ways I think the vision of Hungary and Poland is very, very different from the British vision, but I think that's true in terms of the idea of a Europe of sovereign states. Yes.
So it hasn't created the waves it might have done, but Europe's creating plenty of waves for itself internally.
In fact, after Brexit, what we were talking about was the collapse of Europe.
Yeah.
And the process of Brexit, the horror that UK politics has undergone, the very disturbing sight for anybody who's a prime minister of Prime Minister May's last 2 years, has completely changed that conversation, even though no one acknowledges it. And so there isn't any more prospect of countries leaving the EU. They've all switched to this debate about how to reform it.
Yeah, it's true that didn't happen. There's something else, though, it seems to me, that didn't happen either, because my memory of the discussion that was taking place in continental European countries in the run-up to Brexit was that there were essentially two ways of looking at this. One was to say this will be a huge disaster if Britain leaves the EU. The other saying actually this is kind of an opportunity. We get rid of this very difficult member state. But both sides, it seemed to me, what they had in common was they thought that what would happen if Brexit happened, and very few people in continental Europe believed that it would, but if this happens, what must happen is some big push for further European integration. That also hasn't happened.
We're going to come back to Europe, but I just want to ask, do you have a feel for how those nations that sometimes look like the sort of Bond villains of the world, the spectre, look upon Britain at this moment and game our future?
I suppose you're talking about Russia and that
Possibly.
kind of...
Whatever made you think that?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess it was all those pictures of Vladimir Putin with cats. But I think that the Russians have seen Brexit as part of the sort of decadence and confusion of the West. The fact that it is sort of taken up by its own internal struggles. They have probably, we don't really understand the extent of it, but probably attempted to fuel that as well, but only adding fuel to the fire, not creating it. That's certainly their perspective. And they see this this lack of stability as, generally speaking, beneficial to the sort of Russian idea that the world needs to be run on more authoritarian, more sovereigntist, more transactional lines. But I have to say, they don't really have any sort of plan for this, and they don't really understand where they're going with Brexit or where Britain is going with Brexit.
But it's an opportunity, or it plays into an opportunity.
Well, it's let's say part of an idea of confusing the world that sort of appeals to them. But you see even them pull back from it very frequently, because Britain is a place for them, London is a place for them, which has always served as a sort of refuge, both for their money and their persons. And they have always valued the stability of Britain, and they were never intending, they don't want that to be completely destroyed. And so sometimes I feel like in Russia they're a little bit worried about catastrophic success with Brexit. They did like the idea of pushing this idea, and they were happy in the initial instance with the result. But I think sometimes they're wondering maybe they succeeded too well.
Other bits of the world, Hans, are you? Or Russia itself? Are you?
Well, I think this is incredibly unpredictable. We in Britain, I think, don't know what's going to happen, which is partly why I think actually it's quite exciting in a way.
That's one word for it. Yeah.
So I don't think the Russians can possibly know what's going to happen with Brexit, and it could be a good thing for Russia. It could be a bad thing. I think it's worth stressing that Britain's commitment to NATO remains as strong as ever, and one of the possible outcomes here is that NATO actually becomes a more important venue, as it were, for British multilateralism once it leaves the EU. So it's not obvious to me that this is good for Russia. But the other thing is, I do worry a little bit about the tendency that we have at the moment to think in very binary terms. This is a struggle between some kind of monolithic liberalism and some kind of monolithic illiberalism. So, Jeremy, you just used, the word authoritarian and sovereigntist, and that may be, from the Russian perspective, maybe those two things go hand in hand. But it's not clear to me, if we look at Brexit, that those two things do go hand in hand at all. And it seems to me, whatever you think about Brexit, it was driven to a large extent by concerns precisely about democracy. The idea that some people have, for example, in America or in continental Europe, that Brexit is part of this kind of populist wave, part of some kind of authoritarian shift, I don't think is really very helpful.
Look, I think that we can agree that the beating heart of the start of the Brexit movement was this democratic urge, as you described it. But it has a problem, which is that it makes no sense, which eventually will matter. It is not the EU which is creating this hyperglobalization. It is not the EU which is restricting Britain's ability to decide these things. It is the world.
We had a funny moment yesterday when Liam Fox was in the House of Commons talking about how we hadn't quite got ready all the trade deals that needed to roll over, and he said actually it's proving to be rather difficult, because they come back to us with all sorts of requirements, like certain of them say, actually, could you drop the EU requirements on human rights that they put into the trade? And you thought, well, surely that was what you were expecting to happen. How else are you going to do a bilateral? There's going to be all sorts of things that you're open to and pressures that you're open to.
So look at the two big issues that the U.S. will bring up when they have a trade deal, when they negotiate a trade deal with the UK. They've already had preliminary talks, and these are the issues that have come up. Well, one of them is food safety regulations that the EU has imposed that restrict things like chlorinated chickens and genetically modified organisms from U.S. agriculture coming in. And U.S. agriculture is very efficient and very low priced. And if these things are reduced, then I think you'll see that UK agriculture will struggle with this, to compete with the U.S. agriculture on these terms. The second thing that's very interesting to the American negotiators is the NHS. It's the idea, it's a huge organization that spends a lot of money, opening it up to foreign competition, perhaps the ability to do, for some of these private companies, to do for British healthcare what they've done for American healthcare, is something that is very attractive to American industry.
We may discover that Britain's not quite as free trade as we thought we were, and we've been hiding behind French skirts all these years and pointing the accusing finger at EU partners, perhaps.
So there's two choices there, right? Either they accept these American demands, in which case they haven't satisfied the demands that led to Brexit, or they don't, and in which case they don't get the trade deal that they want.
Hans, you're bursting. You to come back.
I think there is an argument for being part of a smaller unit where although you couldn't, you don't have the same amount of leverage. You can pursue your interests in a tighter kind of way. Having said all that, I basically, as I say, I voted to remain, and not only that, now that we're leaving, I would still argue that we should remain part of a customs union, because I think those arguments that you've made, Jeremy, are on balance, are right. But the way I think about all of this is that, as I say, it's a backlash against hyperglobalization, and the left and the right have a problem with different aspects of hyperglobalization. So, as I say, this is very, very unpredictable, and I think what's exciting about this is that we are now
There's that word again.
Yes, that we're trying to reconcile.
Jeremy just looks nervous.
Yeah.
Well,
it's a very optimistic version of exciting. I think we both agree that that's unpredictable.
I'm nervous.
We just have distinct views about how good that is.
I'm nervous too, but I do think that there's something going on in Britain now where we're trying to reconcile these different interests in a way that we haven't for most of my lifetime. The parameters of British politics have been very narrowly defined, for my entire life. Margaret Thatcher was still Prime Minister when I turned 18.
It's amazing to me that you think that's a bad thing. I think that's something that that most countries in the world would deeply desire. This idea that
the clarity, you mean?
Yeah, and the predictability and the stability. The idea that politics is predictable is very bad for analysts like you and me, and very good for everyone else.
I'm not sure.
I wouldn't get into the prediction game a bit, though, because I'm going to go back to something you were talking about a second ago, which was the idea that Britain's role in NATO itself might get bigger, Britain might continue to play a big role. Is that actually how people see it? Because at the moment, there is a sense, I saw this morning, that Britain is currently portrayed in the Dutch media through government advertising as a giant blue muppet called Brexit, who gets in the way every time a business is trying to get to the phone on the desk and the rest of it. And this is we have become a bit of a joke figure. You alluded to it with Laurel and Hardy. Are we really seen as people who are going to be significant players militarily, equal to our past role, keeping our United Nations Security Council seat, big in NATO, or are people beginning to just think a bit differently about us as they game where Britain will really be 20, 30 years from now?
Yeah, I think there's no question that people are at least beginning to think differently about that. I mean, it should be said that, the UK starts from a position in the world of enormous soft power and prestige. I mean, this is a country that people have always really admired. I just think that one of the things that they have admired about it is not exactly its power, at least in the last few decades, which there is plenty, but really Britain has always been seen as punching above its weight in the last few decades, in part because of its relationship with America, in part because of its relationship with the EU, its membership in the EU, but even more fundamentally because it is this sort of stable, right-thinking country that is sort of a voice of sanity on the world stage, especially relative to the Americans. The Iraq War was a big blow to this idea, and Brexit has been a bigger blow to this idea. And now people are sort of starting to look at Britain and say, okay, well, it's still a reasonably powerful country. It's still obviously going to play in world affairs. It's gotten rid of its EU membership. That's one big source that it no longer has. Its relationship with the United States will be more and more instrumentalized by the United States. It can still play, but it doesn't seem to have the sort of sanity and stability and voice of reason that it used to, so it's not going to be as important.
But I mean, I think it's quite difficult.
I've provoked him, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it's quite difficult to generalise about the way the rest of the world sees Britain, because I think it is different in different parts of the world and different people, and
but that's my job.
Exactly, but even in America, there are different. There are some people that actually quite sympathise with Brexit. If you take the example you mentioned, the Iraq War, I mean, what is the aspect of that, as you say, was a blow to the perception of Britain? Was it the fact that Britain took part in the Iraq War, or was it the fact that there was a massive backlash against it? From an American perspective, it might be, that Britain, after Iraq is no longer as reliable an ally as it was before. But, a lot of the rest of the world looked at the fact that Britain took part in the Iraq War as being the problem. And so,
That's the part I was referring to. I think that's actually the part in the United States even that is seen as a problem. It's intriguing in the United States. Of course, this is retrospective, but generally speaking, on all sides of the aisle, the Iraq War was seen as a mistake, even in the United States. It's interestingly a mistake that the United States has moved beyond a little bit more than the United Kingdom has. But actually, when they look back at the issue, people are a little bit upset with the United Kingdom that it failed to stop the United States. This is absurd, I grant you, but this is a little bit the way that people look at it.
Well, we claimed we were Macmillan's Kennedy, Greece to
yeah,
Rome.
it was the advertisement. And in fact, what happened was that Tony Blair basically went along with George Bush's deception.
Right.
And so that was disappointing to a lot of Americans. At the
Aren't
time,
we correcting that now? I mean, this is exactly my point. Is it seems to me that what's happening both on the left, clearly with Corbyn, but also on the right, is that this, it seems to me that the approach Britain has taken over the last 30, 40, 50 years has sort of, reached the end of, we've run out of road. And one aspect of that is the economic policy, basically neoliberalism that we followed, since Thatcher. But it seems to me another aspect of it is our foreign policy.
Punching above our weight, that stuff.
Well, to some extent punching above our weight, but specifically the special relationship. So I hear people on the right, people like John Redwood and so on, who are quite, he says that the biggest mistake he made in his political career was to vote for the Iraq War. So it seems to me there's a certain, in a way, I think what's happening is that there's a sense that we need to correct this now in exactly the way that you're saying Americans wish we have done.
But isn't the truth, going back to your point, Hans, about post-Brexit, are we going off to a Corbyn future, are we going off to Singapore? Yeah. Likewise, we don't know what the real driver was, or rather where people wanted to take a British foreign policy. There was an isolationist element to Brexit. We don't want. There was some. I think there were some people who didn't like abroad, like the Anglosphere, don't like foreign aid, think we're too obsessed with abroad, and I think that was a component, wasn't it, for some people? And yet there was also another component, which was we're going to go global and be bigger than ever. It seems to be all part of a massive identity crisis, which hasn't resolved itself.
I'm not sure it's a crisis, but yes, yes. This was my point. These things are all up for grabs now. We're debating these things, I think, in a way that we weren't before Brexit.
Yeah, the debate is very lively, but I have to say that when I looked at when they were framing the Brexit debate, the idea was that there were options in foreign policy that Britain was not taking because they were so tied to the EU. One of those options, I think a key one, you really see this in the campaign and especially immediately afterwards, is the American option. That we can sort of fall back on the special relationship, we can fall back on the Anglosphere, I guess, and that can be a source of British leverage in the world. And I still see that. It's a little bit diminished since Trump is so obviously uninterested in it, but I still see it, and I think it demonstrates the fact that in order to prescribe Brexit in a world which is as difficult as this one is, you had to have an idea of where your leverage was going to come from. And there were lots of different fantasies spun out. Admittedly, there were 5 or 6, as you said, and they've created these conversations. But actually, none of them really make any sense. The best one that they had going for them was the one that they just got rid of. And I think no one has been able to articulate even a vision that makes any more sense than what Britain is leaving. Now, can they salvage from that a foreign policy which, is able to reasonably represent British interests? Probably. I mean, there are medium-sized countries around the world that are in more difficult positions than Britain that are managing, and Britain can do that. But the idea that Britain is going to have the kind of very special role that it had in the world when it's turned its back on this key source of its leverage, I think doesn't make any sense. And I think it's really important to focus on that.
We've fallen down the scale a bit. Yeah. We will have done at the end of this.
Not necessarily a disaster, but they've given up something, and in doing that, that will matter.
I mean, if we put this in the context of the sort of long sweep of British history, I mean, first of all, Britain has been in relative decline since, 1850. And so, yes, I accept that we're probably declining a bit further. But
it's a long run, yeah.
And the important point I think there is that Britain hasn't been declining in absolute terms, and I think that will continue to be the case. The second thing is that there's continually in British history, in a way this is the story of British foreign policy, it's been this oscillation between focusing on the European continent and focusing on the rest of the world. And the way I see this is we're in, at the moment we're going through another of these swings away from the European continent. At some point we'll probably swing back. I'm not quite sure what that looks like. But this all to me feels very familiar from British history. And there's the famous, I think we're roughly where we were in terms of how we think of our identity, as where we were in the immediate post-war period when Winston Churchill draws, these three majestic circles, as he calls it, these different pulls in a way on Britain. One is Europe, the continent of Europe. One is the United States, and the other is, at that time, the Empire, now the Commonwealth. I think we're sort of roughly in the space between those three things, and you have people pulling in different directions. Clearly, the overall context is different. I think this idea that the people who talk about global Britain, or even about the Anglosphere, have some kind of neo-imperial kind of aspirations, I think is misleading. I think in some ways it makes more sense than ever in British history for us to say, well, actually, as the centre of gravity of international politics and of the global economy shifts from west to east, in particular to Asia, in some ways it makes more sense than ever to say, that's where the future is. We need to be part of that. That's not completely crazy, and it doesn't have to be a kind of a neo-colonial project.
And you don't have to do it through the European Union, you think?
Well, you can, but you
don't
don't
do
have
it better by being part of the gang.
I think that's an open question. To what extent being part of the European Union helps or not. The other thing I think though is this all, I think, might look rather different in 10 years' time. We don't know, and this is, I think, very absent from the discussion in Britain, both on the Remain side and the Leave side. We don't know what the European Union is going to look like in 10 years' time. We talked about this a bit at the beginning. Seems to me there's at least a possibility that things go from bad to worse in continental Europe. And then I think, in retrospect, Brexit starts to look a little different than it does now.
Look, of course that's possible. I think we don't really know what's going to happen in the next 10 years, and the EU could go in some very bad directions. But I think the key thing if you're making a foreign policy is to set yourself up for success. And one of the things that Britain had done well in playing a difficult hand in the last 50 years was that it had looked at those three circles that you just described and said, actually, we can gain leverage from all of these. Yeah. Yeah. And specifically, we can use the three of them as balancers with each other. And they had been quite successful at that. And I can tell you from an American perspective, the fact of Britain's membership in the EU, the fact of Britain's influence in the EU is one of the things that sustained Britain's influence with America. Yeah. And I imagine there's a similar dynamic with the Commonwealth. And so having just sacrificed one of the legs of that leverage, both of the others will be weaker. Now, of course, if the EU goes to crap, then that leg wouldn't have been super useful. But all other things being
technical
equal,
foreign policy term there, right?
Yeah, you try to follow me. But all other things being equal, having these diverse sources of leverage, I would say, interestingly, that British diplomacy had played that extremely well. They had gotten so much out of the EU. They had gotten more out of the EU in diplomatic terms than almost any other country, probably more than France, because they had really understood, in a way that most of the other EU countries didn't, how to use the EU as a multiplier of national advantages, of bilateral advantages with the United States, and even with the Commonwealth. Yes. This was an inherent part of British strategy.
But I just want to end by, because as foreign policy specialists, you understand influence. It's not an amorphous term to you. You can probably think of 100 different examples of where Britain's influence helped in the world and helped Britain. But it's something which you, Jeremy, think is going to decline. What will that mean 10, 20, 30 years from now for someone who lives in Britain?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think that it will mean a whole lot, to be perfectly honest. And even as I've been pessimistic about all of this stuff, it's not as if Britain can't have a very good future.
Life goes on.
Life goes on, and as I said, medium-sized countries that struggle to exert their influence can operate very, very well in today's world. And we see a lot of countries doing that by triangulating between different great powers and by keeping a low profile on a lot of issues. So that's fine.
Not saying boo to China and things like that.
Yeah, that's manageable. I think it's a struggle really for British identity. That has not been the British identity in the world for the last 150 years, is to keep your head low and not make nasty comments about great powers. A lot of countries are quite used to that, but Britain is not. And so
might struggle to adapt.
Yeah, they may struggle to adapt. I don't think, and that's why you see all of these, okay, we can get this, we can maintain our previous role through the Americans, we can maintain our previous role through the Commonwealth, we can maintain our previous role through some sort of splendid isolation Singapore thing. Because I don't think British people want to give up on that identity. I think, they probably will.
We might need a different referendum on that.
I think some British people are quite sick of playing precisely that role. So I think that's partly what we're working on.
Do you think we've actually declined in influence, and does that make a difference to life as lived here 20, 30 years from now?
Have we declined, or are we going to?
Will we as a result of this current moment?
I mean, as I said earlier, foreign policy analysts make this distinction between absolute decline and relative decline. You can decline in relative terms, your influence in the world can decline, but everyday life, quality of life for your citizens can continue to rise. And that would be my kind of my prediction if I had to make one. But I think the most crucial thing is, given, as I say, that everyone, at least in the West, is going through somewhat of a similar crisis, which is how do you reconcile integration, globalization with democracy and a sense of control? I think the crucial thing is, can Britain find a way of doing this? And if it works, and as Mark Carney said earlier this week, if this works, a way of recalibrating globalization and rebalancing that, getting that balance right between the benefits of globalization and democracy, then it seems to me that Britain potentially, if it works, and that is a big if, I accept that, then potentially I think Britain almost has a kind of a model function potentially for other countries in the West. Now, it could all go disastrously wrong, I accept that, but it seems to me that probably in terms of, if we're talking about British influence in the world, that's probably the biggest contribution Britain can make.
That's really interesting, and I guess I'd have to agree, even though I hadn't thought of it in those terms, that is a theoretical possibility.
You're not sounding convinced.
I have to say, though, that when I look at British politics right now, when I look at the sort of incapacity to decide, when I look at the different strands of where people want to go, when I look
Supermodel is not the phrase that goes through your mind.
When I look at the lack of response to the very important questions that you just posed, I don't really see them being able to settle on that kind of model. But I would admit that it is a model that is open to the UK.
It's chaotic, but I think this is what democracy looks like.
What a perfect note on which to end. Thank you both very much indeed for a discussion that was anything but chaotic. Thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. Thank you.